Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Global Islam Current Debates. And today, it's my pleasure and honor to have Dr. Ross Moret joining us. Dr. Ross received his PhD from Florida State Department of Religion, where he studied in the Religion Ethics and Philosophy program. Professor Moret's teaching and research interests focus on Christian and Muslim political ethics, and he's particularly invested in understanding the ways that social science can contribute to our understanding of how norms are developed, maintained, and challenged in group life. Before coming to Florida State University, Professor Moret earned graduate degrees from Florida Atlantic University, Valparaiso University, and Princeton Theological Seminary. When he's not teaching or doing research, he enjoys spending time with his wife and two sons, coaching baseball, traveling, or seeing a good movie. Dr. Ross, today we're reading your valuable 2008 paper, Potential for Apocalypse, Violence, and Eschatology in the Israel-Palestine Conflict. As you soundly argue, eschatology, and I'm quoting you, eschatology often serves to heighten the aspects of cosmic warfare. Once the struggle has been conceived in cosmic apocalyptic terms, it becomes increasingly easy to view opponents as the other. Our reading for today is a very valuable paper that deals with eschatology, or the study of last things, as one branch of religion that is particularly prone to produce violent reactions. To you, Dr. Ross, on your paper.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Abla, for having me, and also for that very kind introduction. I do appreciate it. I thank you all for being here. Can I share my screen? Is that possible?
Yes, sure.
Okay. All right, so here we go. So can you all see this?
Perfect.
Okay, great. So just as a little bit of an introduction, so I will go over briefly the argument and its main points. I know you all have read it, so I won't spend too much time there. And then I do want to maybe make a few adjustments. I wrote this as a graduate student a few years ago, so I'd like to maybe point out some things that I could have done better. And then I also want to point to some ways that the observations and arguments I tried to make in the paper have cropped up in a couple of different places since 2008. So anyway, that's what I plan for today. Then I very much look forward to your questions. So again, thank you for having me. All right, so the basic argument of the paper is it works to put the language that social scientists and also some theologians have used to think about political violence into conversations about some theological categories, and specifically eschatology. Some of the categories I use, one is fundamentalism, right? And one of the elements of fundamentalism is that usually fundamentalist groups view themselves as a kind of extension of God in some way, or of what God would want, or God's teachings or something, right? So the idea being that our group has everything right, and therefore other groups don't. And this is often founded, especially in the monotheistic traditions I talk about in the paper, rooted in a particular interpretation of the tradition or of the Bible or the Quran, in addition to other sorts of traditions. And then I put that into conversation with a particular element, a theological element called eschatology, which is about the end, right? So all these three traditions share this idea that God is all good and all powerful. And so a kind of extension of that is that at some point, God is going to make everything right. And what does that look like? Given the injustice that we see in the world, given the historical problems that humanity has faced, given the way we treat each other, this is going to involve some level of judgment, some level of setting things right. And all three traditions, at least elements of the tradition, seem to agree that it's going to have some level of sorting, right? So the good over here, the judged over there. And like Dr. Abla said, there are sociological elements involved here that can contribute to a level of political or religious violence. So I have those two religious categories up and running, and then I put it into conversation with the work of Manis Midlarsky, who talks about, he's involved in a number of things, but one of those is genocide studies. And what he finds is that it's when a group commits genocide, they feel, whether it's true or not, right? They feel like they're under attack, that there's a vulnerability there, that they're under threat, and that there needs to be a response to this grave threat that they're facing. And then in addition to that threat and vulnerability, they have some level of political power. So that's where the realpolitik comes in, right? So a weak group is not able to commit genocide because they don't have the political means to do so. So there has to be a certain level of political power there. I also use this category developed by Mark Juergensmeyer, a scholar of religion, who talks about cosmic warfare. And so this is often, but not always, paired with eschatology. The idea that the conflicts we see on Earth are a manifestation of a deeper battle between good and evil. And the argument in the paper is that when this is paired with a fundamentalist mindset in which we're the good, they're the bad, and it's put into cosmic language, it seems to underwrite a kind of violence that may or may not be there otherwise, right? So it's a way of essentially demonizing the opponent. And so then that leads into the last set of language, this developed by James Waller and Jessica Stern. So James Waller's book called Becoming Evil. And then Jessica Stern, she talks a lot about terrorism and the way that people sort themselves into groups, demonizing other groups, and using hard categories of us versus them. And when this happens, when the other group is demonized, dehumanized, they become easier targets for violence. And when it's put in this cosmic language, right, when it's for example, God versus Satan, we become kind of the heroes, they become the villains or enemies. Again, it's a dangerous situation for violence. So, and then in the paper, of course, I go through some of the specific theological elements in Christianity and Judaism and Islam, which is most relevant to this course, and just talk about the ways that the language that has been developed, where in the end time, there's some kind of messianic expectation that some combination of Jesus and the Mahdi or some other kind of Messiah in Judaism will return and set things right, and that will involve a lot of violence, and that some people can interpret that as an invitation to contribute to the sorts of conditions that will lead to this return. So that's where this narrative element gets involved. And in my estimation, all three traditions have at least the potential for that kind of thinking, right? It's not predetermined. Plenty of people push back against it, but it is there as a kind of resource. Okay, so that was the argument in the paper, and I did want to, I did want to mention a few things that I maybe would do a little bit differently now. So this word retractionis, it's a Latin word. I'm borrowing it from St. Augustine, who wrote this book, Retractions, at the end of his life, where he's like, oh, I should have done all these things differently. So this is a small element of that. So Bernard Lewis, I don't know if you've talked about him at all in the class, but you probably talked about Orientalism. He's a kind of famous Orientalist, and I used a quote from him that probably I should have either pulled out or been more critical of, where he talks about the sort of what he called Muslim rage, which is pretty problematic. So I would have, you can ask me about that later if you want to, but just to kind of signal that that probably should have been changed. I use the term Islamism, and I should have probably talked more about it. There are all kinds of different Islamists, and maybe you've talked about this in the class too, but the basic idea is that some Muslims make a tight connection between politics and religious tradition. And that can take all different kinds of forms. And I probably should have gone into that more, but basically, there are some quietist Islamists who think that yes, there should be this connection, but ordinary people shouldn't be involved with it, really. It should be the governing authorities. There are others who have a more democratic kind of leaning toward Islamism. And then, of course, there are some who have a more, I used the word fundamentalist before, but hard line, and then even on the far right, more jihadi groups. So I probably should have gone into that a little bit more. And then I definitely should have talked more about, since I was talking about Israel and Palestine, particular Palestinian groups, especially Hamas. And if you all are interested, you could look at for example, their 1988 charter document that includes all kinds of language that is eschatological and would fit really well into the kind of analysis I did in the paper. Okay, and then just a couple of refining elements that might have been helpful. So one is Midlarsky, who I used, developed this language of ephemeral gains in a later book. And the idea here is that oftentimes he says when political extremism takes root, it's in relation or framed by a narrative of what he calls ephemeral gains. And the idea is that the group's believes, or maybe it did have in reality, some kind of glorious past, and that past has been unjustly taken. And this leads to, again, to that kind of threat, identity threat or political threat we talked about earlier. And that what we want to do is get back to that state of glory. And so this is a pattern he finds, and he uses all kinds of different examples to illustrate how it works. But I think that this is definitely relatable to not only the cases that I talked about in the paper, but especially some of them I'm going to talk about in a couple minutes. And then Khaled Abu El-Fadl, who's an Islamic scholar at UCLA, he uses this word in this book, The Great Theft, puritanical, which is probably in some ways better than fundamentalism. The idea of fundamentalism was originally a word used to describe Christian groups who wanted to go back and assert the truth of certain fundamental elements of Christian faith. And then it's sometimes used, expanded to talk about other groups. But something is lost, I think, in that expansion. So, and his point is that, look, all Muslims, or at least the majority of Muslims, are going to have a strong adherence to the Quran and the Hadith, etc. And so in some sense, they might be fundamentalists, but it doesn't mean that they're puritanical. So puritanical might be a better sort of word. And there the connotation is much of what I was trying to bring out in the paper, right? When a group thinks that they're the only ones who hold the truth, that they're on God's side, and so on and so forth. So maybe just a couple of adjustments that might have been helpful. Okay, and then so what I want to do now for the rest of the time I have is talk a little bit about how I think some of the arguments I made in the paper have been relevant to what we've been seeing happening in the last roughly 13 years. So I'll just gesture briefly to Israel and Palestine, because I don't think actually that things have changed that much there. I think that things have kind of been in a holding pattern for the most part. We've seen, yes, eruptions of violence at different times. I think you can talk about a lot of those eruptions of violence in the language I developed or employed. But thankfully, we haven't seen a sort of large scale set of violence that I've been worried about. We have seen it, however, in two cases, especially that I'll bring up, that I think where things have deteriorated or really run aground, unfortunately. So one of those you may not be surprised to think about is ISIS. So the Islamic State group very much embodies, in the most extreme way possible, this puritanical mindset. I mean, they're the most extreme group I think we've probably seen. And they're also very highly invested in this apocalyptic, eschatological language. So one of their main leaders, this quote over here, Abu Ayyub al-Masri, he said, "We are the army that shall hand over the flag to the servant of God, the Mahdi. If the first of us is killed, the last of us will deliver it." So the idea there very often is that ISIS really believed, especially in its heyday, 2014, when they're expanding very quickly, they really believed that they were in a sense ushering in the end. And this, if we go back to what I said in the paper, I mean, I think a lot of their violence was justified in the sorts of terms that I laid out there. Now, there was some level of softening in that insofar as the person they named Caliph, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, he was named Caliph and they didn't call him the Mahdi. So there was some kind of hedging there, right? However, you do see this apocalyptic language in a lot of places. For example, their first magazine, which you can see on the top right there, called Dabik, is named after a town that shows up in some of the apocalyptic language in prophecies and so on. And they made a really strong effort to conquer that town so that they could claim it as a part of, we're ushering in the end. And then they named the magazine after it. Now, when they lost the town, which they eventually did, then they renamed the magazine Rumia, which is a term associated with Rome. And the idea there is that they were suggesting that they were going to take over the city of Rome, right? So it's going to be a kind of global caliphate, which is one of the reasons they hate the term ISIS, because ISIS is the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and they recognize no borders, right? So they want it to be just the Islamic State. At any rate, a lot of appeals there to apocalyptic language. You see, again, the sorts of, again, a group getting enough power and feeling threatened enough that they engaged in some pretty terrifying violence. Another situation where we see some of these dynamics is, unfortunately, in the United States right now. So a lot of people are worried about the deteriorating political situation here. And a lot of it is put into, especially by certain groups, a sort of apocalyptic language. And the whole narrative, so if we go back to this ephemeral gains language from Manis Midlarsky, people feeling threatened, right? Well, what was Donald Trump's campaign slogan? Make America Great Again, right? This idea that we used to have something that we've lost, we're under threat, and we need to reassert ourselves. So there's this sense of threat, especially on the right and the far right. And Trump and some of his followers have really kind of stoked political fears by using that. Now, eschatology also comes in a number of different ways. So, for example, you look at this image at the Q, right? We're probably most of us familiar with QAnon at this point, but the basic idea there is this pronunciation that there's a secret cabal of leaders who are pedophiles and that they're somehow running the whole world, and that Donald Trump is going to be this sort of messianic figure who's going to end this pedophile ring. And Q is someone who shows up on chat rooms and such and posts these sorts of prophecies, right? So there's a significant amount of eschatological language involved with Q, and especially among Republicans, Q is gaining some frightening footholds. There was a poll out not too long ago in which a question about, do you as a respondent think that the world is being run by a underground pedophile ring? And I believe it was 15% of people said that they thought it was. So that's concerning. But you also see it in some forms of Christianity. So that this book down here by this white evangelical pastor, Rick Joyner, called The Second American Revolution / Civil War. He describes it in this way. I mean, I pulled this right off of Amazon. So this is one of his main quotes about the book. He says, in 2018, I had a dream of a coming second American Revolution or Civil War. In this dream, I saw events that are now unfolding at a rapid pace. I saw the conclusion of our present trauma and the triumph over the evil that has been subduing our land. I saw how this victory will be accomplished. This is what I saw. So if you go to the last book in the Bible, the book of Revelation, or if you go to the book of Daniel, which are the two main apocalyptic books in the Bible, they're both about dreams. They're both about a person having a dream about what will happen in the end. So he's playing right into that kind of trope. And you can see all these sort of marks of eschatology in his presentations or in his books. So, he has a dream. He's seeing good versus evil. He's seeing the good overcome the evil, and he thinks this is going to require violence. And he's actually advocating for people to at least at this point collect arms for this sort of violence. And then we also see it, of course, you see this picture here with the sorts of white nationalism. They're probably, less direct appeals to eschatology among these groups, although, they sometimes overlap with Q or with some of the others. But what you do see there is, again, this sort of threat mindset where, and this being race-based, right? White people under siege, and then the kind of unfortunate but predictable violent reaction in response. So the point being, I think that while I went back, it's been great to revisit this paper, which I wrote at this point a while ago. And, I do think there are some things that I maybe could have tweaked, but I also think that some of what is there is still pretty relevant to what we're seeing, both in this country and some other places. So I just wanted to kind of open things up a little bit there to think about these categories in some ways that weren't addressed directly in the paper. So that's kind of what I had. I'm very, very happy to talk longer.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ross. And I bet my students have a lot of questions to ask you. We're gonna devote the rest of time for questions. Thank you for the very valuable paper. And it's amazing how it's still relevant, as you mentioned, to our times. And probably it's gonna still be relevant for years to come. I don't know if this is bad news or good news, but yes, it's gonna still be there probably as long as we still have this shared between the three religions mindset of thinking eschatology the same way. I would like, before we pause the recording, just to get an update from you on your current research before we start.
Yeah, thank you. Yep. So I wrote my dissertation on small groups of Muslims that have joined bodies like ISIS or have planned to go, and looked at the ways that social science can help us understand those and think about how, yes, certain resources in a tradition are used to justify those sorts of moves, but a lot more is going on than that, and also looking at ways in which we can use religious resources to de-escalate and de-radicalize people who have started on that path or go down that path. So I've published a little bit about that. I'm still working on it to see if it's going to become a book or a collection of articles, but that's what I've been working on. Thank you.
Good luck. We always would love to hear from you updates on your research. Thank you so much for joining us virtually at Nebraska University today, Dr. Ross. Thank you.